Our story starts off with a boy, Atsushi, admiring the floor. He explains that he is on the brink of starvation because they threw him out of the orphanage. Atsushi gets up and chooses the thug life. So he decides that the next person he sees is going to be a wallet lighter. But he turns around to see a biker and makes it slide. Next comes the military, but his mafia boss level isn't high enough yet. So he turns around and sees someone floating in the river. Atsushi jumps in and rescues Dazai, who scolds him for interrupting his journey to heaven. Dazai explains that his dream is to book a vacation to Jesus without disturbing anyone. He notices that Atsushi is hungry though the river seems to have robbed him. Kunikita suddenly begins shouting at Dazai for messing up his schedule. So Dazai decides that his friend will buy everyone lunch. They go to a restaurant, where Atsushi stuffs his face while Kunikita continues to nag Dazai for messing up their mission. Atsushi thanks them for feeding him and reveals that this is his first meal after Batman Camp kicked him out. Kunikita decides that it's time for them to get back to work and reveals that they're a part of the armed detective agency. Atsushi realizes that they work for an organization that deals with supernatural activities and are made up of superhumans. While Dazai admires a support beam that would be great to straighten out his neck. But Kunikita kindly asks him not to. Atsushi asks what kind of mission they're on, so Dazai explains that they have been tracking down a tiger who goes around and terrorizes people. Atsushi begins freaking out and tries to leave, so Kunikita grabs him and asks what he knows about it. But Atsushi tries to do the race, so Kunikita introduces him to the floor. Dazai convinces Kunikita to release him and asks about the wild pussycat roaming the streets. He explains that at the orphanage the tiger would randomly appear and destroy anything it could find. So they were forced to kick him out to save some money. But after he left, the tiger still followed and stalked him from the shadows. So he kept running away. Dazai decides to invite Atsushi on the case and gives Kunikita a note to bring to their boss. But Atsushi refuses because he doesn't want to be bait, until he gets tempted by the bag. At a warehouse, our oddball sits and waits for the tiger. Atsushi begins to get nervous, but Dazai says that when it shows up he will easily defeat it. They hear something in the distance, so Atsushi start freaking out, but Dazai tells him to calm down because tigers can't appear out of nowhere. He goes on to explain that the orphanage wouldn't kick out a defenseless child, and it's strange that everywhere he goes the tiger suddenly appears. While Atsushi transforms into a giant hairy pussycat, the furry attacks Dazai, but he easily evades all his strikes and contemplates going to Jesus. He decides to activate his ability and disable Atsushi's transformation by touching him. Atsushi falls into his arms, but he didn't say pause. So Dazai makes him embrace the floor. Kunikita arrives with all the other members of their agency and asks what they're gonna do with Atsushi. So Dazai decides to make him into their newest member. In the morning, Atsushi wakes up in a room and hears a phone ringing. He picks up the phone as Dazai answers and asks him for help. Our favorite furry goes outside to see that Dazai is stuck in a tight hole. He explains that he thought it would be a fun way to leave his mortal vessel, but it's painful, so he wants to find another way. Atsushi gently helps him out, then they go into town. The duo encounters Kunikita, who tells them about a bomber who invaded their agency and is threatening to make them fireworks. They head to their office, where a man has taken a secretary hostage and threatens to send everyone to a better place. Seeing that the situation is serious, Dazai and Kunikita decides to play a game of rock paper scissors, with Dazai being the victor. Kunikita goes out to try and negotiate, but the bomber knows him as an agency member and tells him to bend over a table. Dazai sees that he knows all their members and thinks of someone he may not know. Atsushi goes out and acts like a puss. He tells the bomber that if he blows them off he will never enjoy the joys of life like food and shelter, then goes on to talk about his hardships. The bomber begins feeling depressed, so Kunikita activates his ability and summons a grappling hook to disarm and restrain their enemy. But Dazai walks in, causing Kunikita to get distracted. So the bomber takes the chance to retrieve the detonator and activate the bomb. Kunikita tries to help but gets taken out. So seeing no other options, Atsushi makes the 100 IQ play to push the hostage away and does a Captain America. But the bomb was revealed to be fake as the hostage runs to her brother and embraces him. Kunikita reveals that this was all a test as the agency president Fukuzawa comes in and congratulates him on passing, but he leaves the decision to Dazai to see if he can join them, so they congratulate him on being the newest member of their team. Tanizaki apologizes for acting as the bomber while his sister Naomi participates in a bit of wincest. Kunikita tells him to ignore them while he gives a speech, but sees Dazai asking the bartender to embrace his throat with her hands, so he decides to help a homie in need. Atsushi wonders what everyone did before becoming a detective and guesses that Tanizaki and Naomi are students. Then finds out that Kunikita was a math teacher, but when he thinks about Dazai his mind draws a blank until they reveal that, because no one has ever guessed his past, there is a reward. Trying to chase the bag, Atsushi guesses many professions, but none hits the mark. Tanizaki suddenly gets a call about a job, so they postpone their game and heads over to the office. They meet with the client, but Dazai decides to invite her on a trip to heaven, but Kunikata stops him and drags his victim into an office to administer behavioral correction. The client explains that she wants them to investigate some smugglers so she can report them to the government. So Kunikita puts Atsushi and Tanizaki on the job while Nomi decides to tag along, but he warns them to run if they ever encounter Akutagawa, because he's a violent member of the Mafia. We see our friendly Mafia man enters a police station to drop off a package, but they recognize him, so he activates his ability and relieves the officers of their duty, before leaving a surprise for everyone to enjoy. Atsushi and Tanizaki follow their client to their target site, but it leads to a dead end. Tanizaki realizes that something is wrong as the client reveals that she is a member of the Port Mafia, Higuchi, and takes out her hole makers and makes it go pew pew. Nomi takes one for the team, so Tanizaki starts panicking until she goes over to blow his mind. He activates his ability and turns the world around him into an illusion. He sneaks behind her and begins gently massaging her throat, but Akutagawa arrives to save her from becoming past tense. Higuchi wants a rematch, but his hands slipped across her face, so she apologizes. Akutagawa tells Atsushi that they're here to kidnap him and activates his ability to make him see reason. Atsushi begins to panic as Tanizaki tells him to run, but he rushes at Akutagawa instead and quick slides under his attack. He equips a pure to win the chicken dinner, but Akutagawa reveals he enabled hacks. Because his ability can eat the space the bullets are in to block them, then makes Atsushi a foot shorter. While suffering on the floor, he remembers how well the orphanage used to treat him, and begins to transform into a pussy cat. He rushes at them and blows Akutagawa away, so Higuchi starts emptying the clip with no effect. The pussy jumps at her face, but Akutagawa penetrates it in front of her, but it was one of Tanizaki's illusions. The furry comes behind him, so he gets ready and attack. Dazai appears and cancels out both their abilities. He reveals that he planted a recording device on her while he was rizzing her up. Akutagawa decides to retreat, but promises him that they will come for Atsushi because he's worth a bag on the black market. So Dazai tells them he wants all the smoke. Higuchi tells him that the Port Mafia is the most powerful group in the city and will wipe them out. But he already knows because he is a former executive of their gang. Atsushi awakens in his bed next to Kunikita. He asks about Tanizaki and his sister, but he explains that he's being treated by their healer Yasano, who really enjoys her job. Atsushi finds out about his bounty and begins getting worried, but Kunikita is keeping cool, and is most definitely not scared of fighting the Port Mafia. Over to our favorite Mafia group. We see Old Bro opening a door with style and asks the workers if they're selling on the Mafia's turf. A worker tries to pipe him down, so he says no homo, then goes over to turn him into a pretzel. Taking this as proof, he leaves, but commands his men to book them a ticket to the afterlife. Atsushi sees an explosion in the distance and goes over to investigate. He sees the work of art that the Port Mafia created, and decides to call Higuchi to tell her that he's going to quit the agency to go on the run by himself to protect his friends. Meanwhile, Old Bro meets up with Bandage and Speedo Sound Sonic. They almost get into a fight, but Old Bro is packing heat and stops them. They get a call from Higuchi, who tells them to go out and annihilate the armed detective agency so they can't help Atsushi next time. They head to the office door and knocks with style and see our detectives chilling, so Old Bro decides it's time for a warm-up. Atsushi walks away remembering his trauma from the orphanage, but hears pew pew coming from the agency, so he rushes back and goes inside to see that the Port Mafia got low-diffed by our badass detectives. They begin complaining about all the repairs they'll have to make and begins taking out the trash by making the Mafia men reverse fireworks. Kunikita reminds Atsushi that he's a part of their agency, so he should help, but he begins crying because he found a place that finally accepts him. They begin making repairs, but Ranpo decides it's a good time to go solve a case, so Kunikita elects to send Atsushi with him. They take the train and head to the crime scene. Ranpo asks for his normal detective, but a new unit has taken over the investigation. He says that the victim was one of the officers under his unit who was pewed 3 times in the chest and dumped in the river, so they have no leads. But the other investigators start freaking out as they pull a man outside the river. Dazai is trapped in the net as they interrupted his journey to heaven. They tell him of the job and he gets upset because he didn't get the chance to accompany the victim on her vacation. They realize that the officer was investigating the Mafia, so they may have done her in, but Dazai explained that the Mafia would have broken out her teeth before pewing her in the chest 3 times, so the person who smoked the cop tried to make it look similar to the Mafia to cover their tracks. Ranpo decides it's time to solve the case and puts on his glasses to activate his ability, Ultra Deduction. He realizes that the killer is another one of his officers and asks to see the cop's pewer to check the ammo, but he refuses to do so. The detective begs him to show his pewer to prove his innocence, so he pulls out his holemaker and aims at Ranpo, but Dazai pushed Atsushi into him to restrain the killer. They bring him to the station where he confesses that the female officer was investigating a politician, but she flew too close to the sun and was about to get burned. So he met with her to try and warn of the dangers, but she wanted all the smoke, so the officer threatens to blow his mind if she didn't hand over the evidence. She tried to stop him and made a new hole for herself. Then he called the politician, who told him to frame the Mafia and dispose of her. The killer snitches and tells them where the evidence is. So our detectives leave the station, where the officer thanks them for their help, then they head home. Dazai reveals to Atsushi that Ranpo doesn't actually have a supernatural ability and figured out the entire case through deduction alone. But some things even Dazai can't even reason how he figured out. The next day, Kunikita enters the office to see Atsushi freaking out because Dazai ate a mushroom and has entered the 4th dimension. So he decides to sober him up. They get called for a mission and go to a warehouse to get information on a tip they received about the case. Our team meets with a spy who reveals that the tipster is the Azure Messenger. So they head out and take an Uber toward the place the tipster pointed out, but it's revealed that this is the same Uber that the last 2 victims were traveling in. They arrive at a perfectly normal hospital and wander inside, but they hear a cry for help, then runs to the site to see a saw contraption. So Kunikita channels America to free her from the trap. She tells them that other people are also trapped inside, and Kunikita runs to their rescue. But gas suddenly started filling the room, so Dazai is forced to pull him back. The next day, the news reported that the hostages passed because of the agency. They see Dazai with the victim, then she reveals that she spent the night in Dazai's room. The Riz King takes Kunikita's glasses, which leads him to discover the culprit behind the case. They call over the cab, where they accuse the driver of kidnapping all the tourists so he can sell their organs on the black market for a profit. He tells them that the victims got to their hotel room safely, but Kunikita reveals that he took their clothes and checked into their rooms after he already kidnapped them. The driver breaks under the pressure and asks for protection because he worked for a group that he meets at the harbor, but someone he abducted was with the port mafia. The car begins getting sprayed by hole makers, so the driver runs away. Kunikita instructs Atsushi to get the cops and Dazai to catch the instructor while he distracts and disarms the goons. The car suddenly gets destroyed as Akutagawa arrives on the battlefield and attacks him, but he pews the water pipe behind him to burst, then summons a stun gun to give him a shocking surprise, but he escapes. Then compliments Kunikita of being worthy of being Dazai's partner, but he hears the police coming and decides to do the race.
Like the video. If you liked the video, subscribe for more, and thanks for watching. Stay swifty.